our church, hey, if you carry a gun in church, or if you're considering carrying a gun in church, I want you to stay after church for about 5 minutes and just have a conversation with you. And so church ended, and kind of waiting for everybody to leave, and a few.
Welcome to the John Hallett podcast. Today I'm talking with Bill Anderson about church security, concealed carry, and a problem most people do not want to admit. Having armed good guys in the room does not automatically make the room safer. Without training, communication, clear roles, and realistic decision-making, a security response can turn into chaos fast. We also get into medical preparedness, de-escalation, principles, over techniques, and what happens when your original plan stops working. Let's get into it.
Hey, Bill, welcome back to the show. How's it going?
It's going well. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Just grinding away, feeling kind of old today and achy. But
Yeah,
when you work out with an 84-year-old guy, sometimes it's tough to complain at 54.
I know. I can't even use that excuse because you're like a month older than me, so
A month early. So much older.
so much older. It's the
Not much
mileage,
wiser.
John. It's not the age, it's the mileage, right?
It's the mileage.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think you were one of those old cars that were put in a pristine garage, and I was out left to rust and all
Yeah, whatever. Uh, Somebody beat the engine.
that.
So, well, we've been talking about a lot as usual. You and I usually have a lot going on during classes because a lot of times we're kind of co-teaching or there at the same time. We talking a little bit about concealed carry and what you're doing with our Citizen Defender program out at your church. Fill us in.
Yeah, so I've been taking our church security team, and we have about 8 people that are part of it. Not everybody can make it, but started running them through, the IDS curriculum, because they are people that really don't have, for most part, any background with martial arts or self-defense or anything. They truly are your everyday citizen, and they're probably on the older side. There's a couple of guys that are in their 60s, and I don't know the exact age of all of them, but I definitely think I'm probably the youngest one of the group, and which is typical for a lot of church security teams. You get some of these guys and they volunteer, they want to help out, and they're probably carrying anyway, so they think, oh, this is a pretty good fit for me. There was a time, I don't know, maybe a couple of years ago, that I said to our church, hey, if you carry a gun in church, or if you're considering carrying a gun in church, I want you to stay after church for about 5 minutes and just have a conversation with you. And so church ended, and kind of waiting for everybody to leave, and a few people got up and left, and I said, okay, let me remind you, if you are carrying or if you're thinking about carrying, that's what this meeting is for. And everybody shook their head yes. And I looked over at this one old lady, and she's in her 70s, and she's tapping her purse. And I'm like, so wait a second. There's about 5 people. We have about 80 people that go to our church. I said, there's about 5 people that got up and left. You mean to tell me that all of you guys are carrying? And they all said yes. And a lot of people would go, man, that's great, that's awesome. My heart, John, sank, because all I could see is, if something were to happen, all these guns would come out, and it would just be a free-for-all, and there would be so many friendlies that would be shot, so many casualties that would be shot. And that was when I decided a couple of years ago. It's like, okay, we have to do some training here, and we're going to have to get some organization, because if something were to happen, it would be total chaos, and it would be not good. If all these people who, with their Second Amendment right, and we're a church that believes, hey, bring it, we don't care, we're not going to oppose that, we're not going to, say you can't bring a gun to church. In fact, I'm behind the pulpit and I've got one. So, uh, it's encouraged, but it's also like, we've got to figure this out, because this could potentially be a bad thing. Do people know, do the average citizen know? I mean, it's hard enough, John. You and I have been training this for a long time at this point, several years, probably about what, 4 years, maybe,
Yeah, I
maybe
think something like
five,
that, 3 to 4.
four. 3 or 4. I was thinking more 4 or 5 because I just did level 5, and we did a level about every year. We had a couple early ones, but so, even you and I sometimes struggle with that decision of when to pull and when not to pull. And now you've got people that have zero training, and it's really scary as to, man, these people are going to pull. And so I took my security team. We broke our church up into quadrants, and everybody has a quadrant that they protect, that they oversee, that they're in charge of, if you will. And we started training with IDS, and so that's what I've been doing over here with these guys, at least getting some kind of organization going.
Yeah, that's one of my biggest fears, being in a situation and you've got a lot of concealed carry holders. I mean, I'd rather exit, and get my family safe,
Mm-hmm.
just for that reason alone, because untrained people scare the crap out of me. Because training, 6 days a week, most of the time, we know we can get better. Suck less, train more. And people that don't train at all just scare me to death.
Yeah.
It is a huge fear. Friendly fire, people getting confused in that situation, drawing their gun, somebody, on the security team,
Mm-hmm.
not knowing somebody. I mean, we know under stress, all sorts of things happen, even in a small community like that.
Yeah.
I'd be afraid of somebody turning and shooting somebody from behind potentially because they're firing a gun and they think it's another active shooter and just amped up.
Mm-hmm.
That's a huge thing to battle and get them to train on.
Yeah, we did. I actually did a little scenario for church. I pre told everybody what we were going to do, and it was just, it was an old fire drill type of exercise. And what's nice about our church, we're a rural church, and most people that have been coming here for years. Most people that come here are, of that mindset, uh, you know. And so I said, hey, we're going to run a scenario today. So I kind of told everybody what we were going to do, and I had my son-in-law just kind of dress up as a would-be bad guy, and he came into the church. And even though these people knew it was a drill, even they knew it was coming, the reactions that they had was mind-blowing. Some people stood up and just froze. Some people, crawled underneath chairs. Some people started to try to run and find an exit, and it was utter chaos, and that's something that I know you and I had gotten from Todd Fossey, and you probably knew it before, but fighting is chaos, and it's just, there's no structure to it, and all kinds of things go all different ways, and there's no formula to it. One of the reasons we don't really subscribe to the traditional martial arts is because there's some type of order to that. There's a lot of order to it. Real life events, assaults and things are chaotic. There's just no script. There's no structure. It could go any which way. And, it's just amazing that when you tell people exactly what's going to happen and you're going to run a drill, they still get stuck in their mind and do all kinds of really weird stuff, stuff that they shouldn't be doing.
Yeah. I mean, and some of those are good. We were actually talking about it last night in Peaceful Warrior training that, those are good ones. Sometimes you get stuck, working through those problems are great. It's where, one of my pet peeves is, people get stuck on, well, I was throwing knee strikes, you should be devastated. And I told somebody last night, I said, okay, well, they're not devastated. Why don't you go to plan B? You're stuck in plan A and you've been training, for 4 years. And we know that this stuff is not easy. And if you really want to be a true, protector, you need to be doing this stuff all the time. Otherwise it's superficial. It's just kind of, putting on the badge. I hate, that's not a good analogy, but, it's, people just, posturing and, kind of playing a game, putting on a t-shirt and saying, I watch the UFC and I'm a UFC fighter. And,
Right.
that's not the same thing. And, trying to have the look, it's like kind of like some of those gray man videos. Like that wasn't very gray man of you. So many people are just playing the part, and it takes so much to get truly good if you want to be safe in your community. I mean, somebody like you, at least being the pastor, at least you got the head of the whole thing
Mm,
being highly trained. Now,
yeah.
everybody else is going to fall in because in a situation like that, you need everybody.
Yeah, and that's a model that I think is biblical. A lot of people struggle with self-defense, carrying a gun or even entering into a conflict as a believer, as a Christian, because they'll say, "Oh, well, the Bible says turn the other cheek and forgive and all this stuff," which more times than not, they take all those things out of context. Those things were said within a certain context, because for every verse that you tell me, that God says, "Oh, show love, show grace," I can show you where it says, "Hey, sell your cloak and pick up a sword and defend yourself." And I don't believe that God really expects us to stand by and allow innocent people to be victimized, including our family or even ourselves. In fact, that's when Jesus made the temple or the cord of the whip and cleansed the temple. It was because the innocent were being taken advantage of. That's when he got really upset, is when the innocent were being taken advantage of. So, um, you know, part of being my definition of a pastor is to feed and protect. Okay, so we feed by teaching the word of God, but then there's a time when you protect. The shepherd had the shepherd's hook, and yeah, sometimes there was the hook where you grab the sheep and pull them before they go off the cliff. But sometimes, King David was a shepherd, and he says that he had to fight off bears and lions to defend the sheep, and we have to do that sometimes, and that's the role that I see myself as. And also too, when you look in Genesis with Abram had his nephew Lot taken by 5 kings, and he had a little army, if you will. It says 318 trained men that were raised and born in Abram's household. So he kind of had his own little training system, which I think was kind of cool. It reminds me of, the old martial arts where the family taught the family. And these 318 went out against 5 kings and took back all the people that they took, all the loot that they took, and not one of them was harmed. And so, that's a picture of the church, I think, as well. We've got to protect our own. And going into a community, well, that now trickles into the community, trickles into the family structure. And if we had those mini fence posts, if you will, established around, then you have a strong fence, much stronger than if you just had one strong fence post. And then I think the world, the community, the environment we live in would be a different place.
Yeah, absolutely. I was trying to tell one of the little guys, like 4 or 5 years old, preemptively defending yourself. Somebody's threatening you, you got that bully's got that raised hand, and a lot of times they haven't made that decision. They're threatening to see the reaction of the potential victim, and this little guy tells, it's like, I don't want to hurt anybody.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, that's good, but to the same lines that you're speaking of, if good guys aren't willing to use violence, then the bad guys are going to win all day. We have to be able to stand up to protect our families, to protect ourselves. And it's kind of amazing sometimes, good people aren't willing to stand up and defend themselves, whether they lack training or just, I don't want to call it suicidal empathy, but there is a lot of that out there in our culture these days that you're going, what are you even thinking about? This person would kill you without batting an eye.
Yeah.
And you want to defend them, because you're a good person.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's going to be no good people unless you stand up to these things. I mean, it's off topic, but I was listening to, I think it's Rupert Lowe on Joe Rogan yesterday. He's, I think, a member of parliament over in the UK, and it was a very annoying, because it's just stuff I don't necessarily want to ruin my day. You're just looking to kind of the bad news, and I had stopped listening to the podcast for like 2 weeks or a week or so, and I picked it back up, and he's talking about the rape gangs over there and it being such a real thing, and it just made me so mad. I'm like, as a good person, and letting these things happen, and calling you racist because you don't believe in what they're doing. I mean, they're victimizing young girls and
Yeah.
filming it. It is just absolutely horrid. And we need good people to stand up to evil. Otherwise, it's going to win. And,
Yeah.
and in my opinion, I mean, that's, whether you're religious or not, that's just good people. I don't care who you are, but when you are not falling in line with community, here in the United States, and want to bring your culture in that is just so mismatched, I mean, that can't be tolerated whatsoever. And I feel it's creeping over here more and more. I mean, it was a good podcast, but a lot of it was upsetting, and to see what's happening over there to their citizens, and I mean, essentially bankrupting the government because they're paying for people just like we are that haven't even put in and then don't even want to be part of the system. It's the destruction of, I think, of good. I mean, don't even call it the United States. It's just good and evil.
Yeah, there's a moral law, right? However you want to chalk it up, there's a moral law that, there's things you just don't do. And it doesn't matter your religion, your belief, your nationality, whatever. I mean, you go back in time, and if one tribe went and victimized another tribe, they knew that morally was wrong and they retaliated. So you can try to politically correct all this stuff all day long, but that's one of the issues. Is you mean to tell me that if your family member is being gang raped, you're just going to stand there and let it happen? I think even that motherly, fatherly instinct would kick in, and you hopefully would literally go nuts trying to protect that person. That's what I would hope would happen. But yeah, with the desensitization of the citizenship of the America, if you will, we tend to not want to do that. We don't want to be the person. And then you also have now, if you go and you try to help somebody, now they're coming after you, and they're making you out to be the attacker, making you out to be the bad guy. And you've always got that civil fight, that legal fight, and then the actual fight that you talk about all the time too. And you might be totally right, but you still might end up being bankrupt just trying to protect yourself from from all the lawsuits and things and the damage that happens, because you don't know what's being recorded and what's being put out there. It's a very interesting world that we live in, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I think things, are always kind of a little bit the same, but I don't know, there's something, maybe it's our age, whatever it may be, but man, it feels different for sure. There's a lot of what I just call craziness and people saying stuff, and they tend to be the louder mouths, where I think a lot of people like us, are working
Yeah.
and doing stuff versus living off the system and everything else. But yeah, it's crazy.
I was having a conversation with somebody the other weekend, and they brought up, flat Earth or round Earth, and I, was talking and telling them my opinion. They were telling me about their opinion, and I said, well, at the end of the day, tomorrow I got to get up and do what I'm going to do. Round or flat, I don't really care. I got to keep going, so it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. Yeah. Like, round or flat, I'm still going to work tomorrow. It's not going to change a lot of
Doesn't
stuff.
change what I have to do, right?
Yeah, I got to take care of business.
And that's a good point, John, because all these things are happening around us, but at the end of the day, we still have to keep going. We still have to keep living. We still have to keep providing. We still have to keep, living. We can't allow the news and all the stuff to get us all, caught up into it and live in this fear and live in this negative thing. At the end of the day, you still got to keep going. And even if the world does get worse, prices get more expensive, oil, whatever. I always say, there's things you can't control. And we can't control necessarily what Washington does. We can't control what the Capitol down in Denver does. heck, we can't control a lot of what the world does, but there are things that we can control. And that's what we need to be focusing on, not focusing on things we can't control, John. And one of the things we can control is our personal security, being our first responder. One of the things I think a lot of people lack is medical training. I think that's huge, because you're probably more likely, even in a doomsday scenario, you're probably more likely to die of an infection than you are of a raid or anything like that. I think there's a huge lack with knowing basics of stop the bleed, tourniquets, chest seals, basic first aids, things of that nature. Everybody wants to carry the gun and do all this gun training. And that's another thing with IDS, I think that we have come to realize is, statistically speaking, the probability of those things are probably further out there than we think, but that's what we want to train. And so you have shifted your training with your gym of, hey, let's really focus on de-escalation and threat recognizing. And, I often joke, it says John has trained me, to fight, to be a black belt. And then after I become a black belt, he says, okay, now let's learn how not to use it. Years of how to use it. And now all of a sudden it's like, okay, here's how you don't use it. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. But I think there's, a perspective shift that we need to, how can we take care of ourselves? Whether it's, protecting, whether it's providing, gardens or, putting food up, or financial. I mean, there's so much things that we can control, John, outside of what we can't.
Yeah, absolutely. Despite that, I'd love to run for politics at some point, but I also think it's a crazy thing. And you're fighting an uphill battle. But man, I feel like sometimes people that should run don't want to, because they recognize how crazy it is. But then we end up with a bunch of crazy people because nobody really wants to be in the game that has, I hate to say sanity, because there's plenty of good people out there trying to fight the battle that way. But, sometimes I feel like doing something would be better than nothing. That's why I keep, we put our nose to the ground. Everything you said, I completely agree with. But at some point, we need to change the system, because I think it's just so corrupt. And there, from our pharmaceuticals to our food, something that you're able to do on your property, which we downsize, quote unquote, with the kids all up to college. It's something we want to downsize bedrooms, but we also want to have place where we can have a garden. So it's not really potentially quote downsizing, but being able to have a little greenhouse and some stuff that we can take care of ourselves. But
yeah,
I don't know. I really wish some better people would run for politics, but
well, it's really hard, because if you don't agree with their agenda, you don't get the funding, and then if you don't get the funding, it's really a hard battle. And honestly, a lot of people that end up getting into the system become corrupt by the system, and if they're not, all of a sudden they disappear, kind of a thing. So is there a way to fight the system by joining the system, or is there a way to fight the system by saying, you know what, we're all clocking out and you can no longer control us? And I think that's a different conversation, because the more community minded we become, and we stop the division, because that's what they want to do. They actually maintain control by keeping the people divided. Because if it's 50% Republican, 50% Democrat, well, guess what? They remain in control. One side doesn't have it, and they both kind of merge there, and it's really becoming people versus the state. And there's a lot of people who you think are good, and you vote for them, and all of a sudden they get in office and they start doing crazy stuff. And I get that. We don't understand all the things that are going on. We're kind of armchair quarterbacks, if you will. We don't really know what the intel is saying. You can get online and read all these things or hear about all these things that they think they know, but I don't really think anybody really knows. but we can pretend that we know and really have no clue. And so again, it kind of goes back to my, hey, if you get more community minded and community built, and if you have lots of those little communities, well, guess what? It becomes harder for the government to manipulate it. And it's like, if the government wants to screw with the food, okay, great. That's why I'm going to grow my own, and there is no such thing as being totally self-sufficient. It's impossible. You can't refine your own gas. You can't make your own oil. There's things that you're going to have to buy. But the less you partake in the system, the less powerful the system becomes. One of the biggest things that a lot of people believe this Iran war is over, it's about the grid, the economical grid, and they're wanting everything to be digitized, and they're wanting to control everything. And the more that we pay into or buy into the the Venmos and the Bitcoins and the digital currency, the more control they have over you. You see, you think your convenience is really freedom, but your convenience is actually putting you into more of a concentration camp. Because if you go all in, let's just say they have another issue, another health scare, and all the money is digitized, and they say, hey, if you don't take the vaccination, we're going to shut you off and you can't buy or sell anything. That's ultimate control. So
Yeah.
how do I go against that? Well, I try to barter, I try to use cash, and even with taxes, they're taxing everything multiple times, and it's ridiculous. We go out and do an electrical job, I'm paying tax on the material I buy. I'm paying tax on the labor. And then I turn around and pull a permit. Well, guess how they value the cost of the permit? Based on the material and the labor. And so I'm basically paying another tax upon the material that I've already bought. And
Yep.
it's how many times can we tax this? And then if you look at that device, how many times has that, let's just say an outlet, how many times has that outlet been taxed? Well, when you brought up the raw materials to make the metals and the plastics and things to form the physical piece, there was a tax. Then it got put to the people who actually put it all together. That was a tax. And then you got a distributor. These things are taxed multiple times. That's why they don't want you to use cash. That's why they don't want you to use the bartering system, because they're not getting paid.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
it's just crazy. Again, we got to work on the things that we can control.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it really just comes down to people need to be so they're too divided. People are, just we can't come together what's actually good for all of us, which just drives me crazy. I'm like,
Yeah.
it's the common good. Well, we've got a couple minutes left. We've been talking a lot about principles and maintaining principles versus just the technique, where we see people get locked into a technique because they feel like they're doing whatever we want to say, gun threat from the front. And now that fight changes, and getting people to think more on the line of a principle than a technique. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so I came up with this thing and I was sharing it with you. I call it the Kingdom Framework, and there's 10 items that I kind of look through as the lens of how I make a lot of choices. And it just doesn't apply to self-defense, but it applies across the board. And being a pastor, they all come from the Bible. And so my first one is purpose over performance. And we are so performance driven that we can lose mindset of what the original purpose is. I'll give you an example. Let's say I have a shovel that I bought at a flea market for 50 cents, and it's rusted and it's looks horrible, right? Or there's a gold plated shovel that somebody had made. And if you look at those two shovels side by side, you might look at that gold shovel and go, man, that shovel is successful, because look at it. It's gold. It's pretty. It's pristine. It shows success. But then when we take those two shovels out to the ground, and the shovel was created to dig a hole. And so now I stick that shovel into the ground and I step on it. Well, guess what? The 50-cent shovel that was all rusted did what it was designed to do. The gold shovel, because it was a weaker metal, looked good, folded in half. So which one truly was successful? The one that fulfilled its purpose. In self-defense, we can look at it this way. If I hit you and knock you out, well, that was the purpose of me throwing that punch, was to knock you out. Now, some people can look at it and go, oh, well, his elbow was up. He didn't hit with his top two knuckles. He didn't put his weight into it. And those are all performance pieces. And so they'll say, well, it really wasn't a successful punch because he didn't have his weight rolled into it. He didn't extend his hand. He dropped it or whatever it may be. And I'm sitting there going, but I knocked him out. If that was the purpose. So in my opinion, it was successful. Now, the saying is this: purpose before performance. I'm not saying purpose instead of performance. So now we go back to the other side of that and we go, okay, well, if I am going to throw a punch with the intent of knocking somebody out, I can better my chances by using my hip, by hitting with those top two knuckles. But we get so focused on performances that we forget the purpose of it. And I think that's one thing we got to keep in mind. But then to your point, another principle is, principles over techniques. We get so hung up on the technique of doing something versus, hey, what was the principle of it? The two kind of go together. If I'm being choked and this choke now changes into, headlock from the side, and I'm still trying to defend against the choke there because that's what the technique is, but the principle now has changed. Now it rolls back into, well, I was not successful in that. So it is hard because in your shoes, when you're giving somebody an advancement in their belt or whatever, they have to know the technique. But at the end of the day, if they're so stuck on the technique can fail them. How many times you've done it to me that, yeah, I know the technique, but when that attack comes on a little stronger, all of a sudden that technique's not working and I'm still stuck in the technique and I'm failing because I'm stuck in that. So there's a balance there that, yeah, we need to know the technique. We need to know the performance, but at the end of the day, what am I really trying to do here? I don't know. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It was, again, I mean, last night watching some advanced students train, and one of them got stuck, with, nothing was crazy fast or strong, but they lost their position. They were still in front and they had two hands, kind of one on the wrist, one on the gun. It was a gun threat from the front, and they were kind of lost, and like their knee strike, even where they were was a very weak knee strike, and I didn't know what to do. I said, you were locked in front, like, take a look at this. I had another black belt. I'm like, help this person out. Like, what do you see? What are you seeing right here? I switched roles so the person could watch, from the sideline. I'm like, what's going to make this better? And, after a couple seconds, the black belt went, how about you move offline? I'm like, exactly. You're in front of the gun. You're battling them. Your takeaway didn't work. A knee strike with a gun down there is shifting your weight, regardless. And if you just got offline, you just made that better, but you were just locked into gun from the front. And I think that's, really hard for people when the fight changes and we're still thinking gun from the front. And it's now changed because they resisted. And I think that's a thing that all, martial arts, especially self-defense, need to add in. And it doesn't have to be super strong. It needs to be varied because it's never going to be the same thing. That's one of the aspects, I think, of, being the coach. You get to train with more people. Sometimes you're just in one class. You're training with the same group of 10 people all the time, and they all tend to do the same things sometimes. So, well, you got a study group of 10 people, 100 people would be even better. to train against, and different reactions, not to mention size. So I think, that's something, we really try to get people to do without being too crazy,
Right.
change things up. I mean, I just, one of our, young Bowden, our 18-year-old guy in the youngest guy in the adult class, I had him, he was working with me in the teen class, and I bear hugged him from the front. And just when he delivered the knee strike, I just kind of went, oh, and just clinched up on him and grabbed him. And as a byproduct of just grabbing onto him, as he kind of dealt with me, I can't exactly remember because being the bad guy, what he did, but I think his weight got off and I had his arm hooked, and now he's getting kind of pulled to the ground. And I didn't even do that much. I was, 10%, and I'm just kind of hanging on to him. Like, look at that problem that he just had to solve. It doesn't need to be much.
Right.
He did a good job. It didn't get, too locked in to the technique, but it's something that we need to fight all the time and make sure we're just training more and doing more variations.
Yeah. Yeah. That kid impresses me. He looks really good.
Yeah.
He reminds me of, gosh, what was his name? He went to, he went into the army or something. What was his name?
Well, there's Ninja Boy, and then there was Michael.
No, to be in
That's the
between
latest.
those two guys.
Oh,
He lived out in Kiowa by me. Remember his family lived out there?
Hayden.
Hayden. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. He reminds me a lot of Hayden. So
Yeah.
that's pretty good. But
Yeah.
it's two ditches, John, and this is a lot of life, right? There's two ditches. You got the ditch over here of technique, the ditch over here of principle, and if you start to slip into one ditch, you can overcorrect and find yourself in the other. And the problem is you get stuck in the ditch, and it's really hard to get out. And you got to drive down the road being aware of both ditches, utilizing both ditches, but keeping your eyes literally on the horizon. Because if I start looking at technique or principle, I'm going to go to one of those two ditches, and I can find myself there really quick. But it, kind of goes into one of those other principles I got is chaos to order. So all of these blend together: purpose versus performance, chaos to order, principles over techniques. They all blend together and they work together. Like when you went to that one attack and then all of a sudden it went to something else and you didn't even know what you did, maybe just your body weight, and you tripped and fell on him. That's chaos. But his job is to take all this chaos and order right and bring order in it. And how does he do that? Well, principles over techniques. They both play a part. You got to remember that they both play a part. We're not saying one or the other. We're saying just don't get stuck in the ditch of one or the other, but you got to go down the middle of the road.
Absolutely. I think that's a good closing point on this one. We'll have to pick back up on this conversation because I like where you're going with all this stuff, but I am out of time today, and I'm sure you've got some stuff to do. So appreciate it. I will see you in the morning.
All right. See you, John. Thanks.
All right. Thanks for listening. Before we wrap up, remember, train more, suck less. It's more than a slogan. It's a mindset. Do hard things. Get comfortable being uncomfortable. Embrace failure, learn from it, and keep moving forward. Nobody gets better by avoiding challenges. And honestly, don't be a wuss. If you're an instructor, martial artist, or serious student looking for pressure-tested self-defense training, instructor development, and practical skills that work in the real world, you can support the show by visiting shop.ClearSky.Training. You can check out our full line of supplements at suckless.co. Also, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button on your social media platform of choice. And by all means, sharing it does a ton to help us build this show and get the word out there. All right, comment, all that stuff helps us out a lot, guys. All right, thanks for listening. Keep training, keep learning, and until next time, train more, suck less.